A couple announcements. The first announcement is that I am not Benjamin Carney. You probably noticed the difference. Adding 10 years to Ben's age, that is me. My name is Thomas Bradbury. I'm a professor here in the psychology department, as is Ben. I'm a colleague of Ben's. And I study close relationships, as Ben does. I am the co-author of your reader. So all of the chapters that Ben did not write, I wrote. So you will have already heard my voice if you read Chapter 1. And I hope you have read Chapter 1, by the way, because we're already on Chapter 3. So I am very familiar with this material. I will try not to screw up Ben's class too much. The reason I am teaching is that his wife is on the verge of giving birth to their second child. He called me this afternoon, later this morning. So I pulled together Ben's slides, looked at my notes, and here I am ready to talk with you about close relationships and intimate relationships. And what I'd like to do today is take you through the second part of the theoretical material. But before that, I want to give you my understanding of where the class should be at this point. And prior to that, I just want to take you through a few quick reminders. The first is that as in the class when I teach it, and I most recently taught this class in the fall of 2008, there is a writing assignment. Probably better to start sooner than later, especially as we all know what happens during midterm week. Keep up with the reading. We have written these chapters over many years, and they are getting shorter and shorter, but they're still not really short. So there is some work to do, and I hope you'll stay up on those. You probably all know that the slides are available for downloading, and I hope you have a version of those with you. Also, I think you already know, I hope you know, that there are videotapes associated with, I believe, virtually every lecture. These are videotapes that Ben and I produced with actually a former student at UCLA. And so I hope you look at those either right before or right after a given lecture. And I know that the theory videotape is especially good. I remember it as one of my favorites, and it really involves some of the leading theoreticians in social learning theory, which you'll hear about today, social exchange theory, ecological theory, and attachment theory, which you've already heard about, and evolutionary theory as well. So I hope you'll not only be tracking the slides, but also the videos that we've produced. And let's see what other announcements I wanted to make. I'm a clinical psychologist. Ben Carney is a social psychologist. Professor Carney is a social psychologist. And we're certainly both within the discipline of psychology and even closely allied within the discipline of psychology. As a clinical psychologist, I'm really interested in relationship outcomes. I'm really interested in how do you understand couples' relationships in such a way that it provides you some leverage for changing them, for giving them the opportunity to have a better relationship. So Ben and I come into the field with slightly different biases and perspectives. You'll see both of those represented in the book. For example, Ben wrote the theory chapter. I did not write the theory chapter. I wrote the clinical interventions chapter, which you'll see right near the end of the class. So that's the material that I cover. I'm really interested in although I'm trained to do marital therapy, trained to do couples therapy, I haven't done that for quite some time. I'm really interested in using what we know through research and creating educational interventions so that if you or anybody like you says, you know, what is it that I could do to really optimize the quality of my relationship, to really make it as strong as I possibly could? Well, if that person were to come to me and have that question, what can I do? I really care about my relationship. I want to be the person who is able to answer that question. Not just for the person who is really struggling in their relationship, but for the individuals who want to keep a good relationship going strong for a long time. So I'm a clinical psychologist, and as I said, I come into the field with a slightly different perspective than Professor Carney. Okay, so my understanding of where you are now is that, tell me if I'm wrong, the first lecture would have been about the importance of close relationships, the intrinsic characteristics of relationships that make them worth studying, as well as the extrinsic characteristics that create benefits for us in our relationships. So I hope you learned about the benefits of our relationships for physical well-being. You know, people who are in good relationships are able to stay healthier. They're able to throw off colds and illnesses faster than people who aren't in good relationships. They live longer lives than people who either aren't in relationships or who are in rough relationships. In addition to physical health benefits, there are psychological health benefits. As best we know, good relationships are one of the best predictors of overall happiness in life. We know that relationships promote financial well-being. In fact, you probably know that the best predictor of poverty in this country is not education, it's not ethnicity, but it's whether or not you're divorced. When you get divorced, at least for a short period of time, you take a very big financial hit. So good relationships allow us to accumulate health and wealth and well-being, and they also are beneficial for our children. And you'll probably learn, in fact, I think I'm the person who's going to be teaching you about the effects of relationships on children. I'm not sure if I said it, but I'll be doing not only today's lecture, but the next 4 lectures as well, the next 2 weeks. So relationships have all kinds of benefits for us. They're intrinsically valuable. They have extrinsic benefits. And the question that we pose in this class is, what are the forces that operate on a relationship? What are the forces that operate inside a relationship, upon a relationship, that allow them to change and grow and develop and take on all of this complexity? Right? That's the question that we posed in the first chapter of our book. And we want to know, why is it some relationships are more fulfilling than other relationships at certain times? And why is it, even for a given relationship, that sometimes it goes really well and sometimes it goes poorly? And in order to understand that, you have to understand how people get into relationships, what they do when they feel stress within the relationship, and all sorts of other things that you'll be learning about in this class. My understanding is that you then had a lecture on methods, the methods that we might use in order to understand those characteristics of relationships that determine whether they're relatively rewarding or frustrating. In your last class, I believe Dr. Carney told you about what a theory is, what a good theory of relationships is, and then offered you an introduction, an overview of evolutionary theory and attachment theory. Are we on the same page? Is that good? Okay. Any questions about any of that stuff that you've covered up to this point in the class? Okay, good. Well, today I'm going to talk about 3 other theories. And when I think about theories, I don't know what Professor Carney said, but when I think about theories, I think of having on a sort of a distorted pair of goggles, or having a kind of a caricature of some phenomenon. And by that, a caricature, it's like a political cartoon, or if you go down to Venice Beach and you have somebody draw your picture down on Venice Beach and they distort your features, and if you've got a big nose, you have a huge nose in your caricature, right? And you got this little tiny body. It's a distortion of reality, but it's a depiction of reality. A theory is a depiction of reality that throws away some details and keeps the really important ones. Okay? That's what a theory is. It's a kind of a caricature. It's like you strap on some goggles and you say, oh, I can see that now. I can see this. I can't see other things, but that's okay. That's what this theory is designed to do. And a theory is designed to explain some regularity in nature. It's a proposed explanation for regularity in nature, and different theories look at slightly different aspects of the phenomena that we care about in this class. Okay? So that's why when you read Chapter 3, you saw not just one theory that explains everything, but different theories that explain different components of how relationships operate, how they unfold, how they change. Okay? So our job in your last class and today's class is to give you a good representation, a good understanding of what it's like to strap those goggles on, what it's like to be that person who says, I see the world through attachment theory. That's how I see the world. Or I see the world from an evolutionary point of view. And today we're going to see the world through 3 points of view. The first one is going to be social exchange theory. Social exchange theory goes like this. According to social exchange theory, we are rationalists and economists. We weigh things and make decisions based on those weights. And what we're weighing is whether we're being rewarded or punished for our actions. This is a very primitive idea that pervades many aspects of social sciences, going back to a guy by the name of George Homans back in the 50s. And the idea is, in social exchange theory specifically, that as we apply that idea to relationships, is that partners evaluate the rewards and costs associated with being in a relationship, along with barriers to leaving the relationship and the available alternatives. Okay? So we as relationship partners, this is the goggles that I'm asking you to put on right now. We as relationship partners are always sort of evaluating things. We're always judging the relative rewards that we get as compared to the costs that we're dealing with in our relationship. And as we make some decisions about our relationship, we're also thinking about what our alternatives are, what my expectations are for a relationship in general, what some of the barriers are that keep me in this relationship. Okay? And one of the important things that you want to take away, in addition to that sort of characterization of social exchange theory, is the idea that satisfaction within a relationship, or how happy you might think you feel in a relationship, is not the same thing as whether or not you want to stay in a relationship. That becomes one of the real interesting and important contributions of social exchange theory. This is a picture of Harold Kelly, a very famous social psychologist here at UCLA. He passed away maybe 5 years ago now. And he was one of the foremost figures in social exchange theory, along with his colleague John Thibault. So this is the general portrait of social exchange theory that I want you to have in your head as we move forward. I should also say that I have annotated Dr. Carney's slides just a little bit, but I haven't deleted anything. So if you see things on the slides that aren't in the versions that you have printed out, they're just a few notes that I added in because I like to add notes into things, and it helps me to keep them in mind as I'm talking to you. But there's nothing fantastically new. It's all really from the readings that I hope you have done or will do soon. And here's the idea. People evaluate and make decisions about their relationship the same way that they make economic decisions, right? And we call this combination, this weighing of rewards that we get in a relationship against the costs in a relationship, we define that as the outcome, okay? And that's kind of an important concept. It turns out to be an important building block for a couple of ideas that you'll see in a moment. So our outcome, how we're evaluating the relationship, is really the difference between the rewards we're getting, subtracting off the costs that we're also having to deal with. And these are some of the notes that I added. So what are the rewards that we get out of relationships? Well, you know the rewards we get out of relationships. We get material gains. It's good to be in a relationship because now it's not just you feeding yourself. Now there's another person and you're feeding one another, right? There's an economy of scale of relationships that is wonderfully powerful, and that's from a strictly true economic point of view why relationships are so valuable. By the way, this is why our federal government cares about intimate relationships. Our federal government doesn't care about intimate relationships because they want everybody to be happy. That's sort of a nice byproduct. Our federal government invests a lot of money in various ways, and more recently than in the past, in intimate relationships in order to keep people together. Because when people separate, when their intimate relationships end, there is a lot of fallout, and the person who is the entity that's paying, that's footing the bill after a divorce is usually our federal government. Our federal government is very interested in keeping relationships together because they're very expensive when they fall apart. So this is a representation of that exact fact, is that we, when we're in relationships, gain materially. There are financial advantages. There are gains in status to being in relationships, generally perhaps, and maybe within your family. There are emotional gains that we get in relationships. There are many, many, many kinds of rewards that we accrue for being in relationships. You can think of many on your own. One important consideration is that the rewards that one person experiences in a relationship obviously are kind of different from the rewards that somebody else is experiencing in a relationship. So it's not as though there is a fixed list, a fixed set of rewards, but there is great heterogeneity that exists within the population amongst all of you. There's heterogeneity even between the two partners within a relationship, so that part of what you have to do in a relationship is figure out what it is that how it is that the two of you can reward one another for being in a great relationship. And also, even for a given person, there are different rewards over time. So that early on in your relationship, you might find one thing rewarding, and then later on in your relationship, that may not be so rewarding at all. Cost, you can also think of pain from being hurt in a relationship, the risk of being betrayed in a relationship. Later in this course, you'll learn a lot about physical abuse in relationships, the suffering that comes from not being as fulfilled as you had hoped to be. So these are some of the costs of relationships. Again, these are going to vary systematically within a population. There are also lost opportunities. For most of us, when we tend to get into relationships, we tend to get into monogamous relationships. That's not always the case. But when you have a relationship like that, that does mean that you are not in a relationship with somebody else, and that can be perceived as a cost. Okay? So this is the building block, this idea that there are outcomes, that we evaluate the rewards that we're getting in relation to the cost that we're having to confront. And it's important to recognize, and the book points out quite clearly, that the outcomes that you are sort of tabulating in your head is different from the level of satisfaction that you're experiencing in your relationship. Okay, satisfaction is not the same as an outcome. Outcomes are building blocks for satisfaction, and that goes like this. So here you see the third line down, that satisfaction, how happy you are in a relationship, is not just the balance of getting a lot of rewards and not having many costs. That's important. You want that. But you're also judging that against something called the CL, the comparison level. The comparison level, that's your expectations. What's it take for you to have a good relationship? Right? What's it take for you to feel satisfied in a relationship? Because there could be one person who has a certain reward-cost structure, right? And another person who has the exact same reward-cost structure. But the first person says, wow, a lot of relationships could make me happy. My expectations for what can make me happy in a relationship are pretty low. So that reward cost structure for this person will increase their satisfaction. You see how that works? Another person will say, you know, I'm sort of hard to please, right? I'm kind of hard to please. My standards are pretty high. And so that same outcome weighed against that individual's comparison level leaves them less happy. Okay? So the key idea here is that comparison levels matter, right? Comparison levels matter. Compared to what? Are you happy compared to what, right? How good is your relationship? Well, there's a lot of good things happening in my relationship and not many bad things, but I expect even more. I expect even more, okay? And that's going to decrease satisfaction. So the key idea is we now have to add in this idea of compared to what? Compared to what do you want, right? And lots of times we don't know that. We have to sort of figure that out. You get into a relationship and you say, wow, this feels pretty good, but not quite good enough, right? Not quite good enough. And so you figure that out often as you go through different relationships. Now, the point I made earlier is that satisfaction, how happy you feel in your relationships, which, as I've just said, we define as the discrepancy between the outcomes that you're getting and your comparison level. That level of satisfaction, how happy you feel in your relationship, is different from whether or not you want to stay in that relationship. Now, all else being equal, people who are in happy relationships tend to stay in happy relationships. People who are in unhappy relationships tend to leave unhappy relationships. But we all know that's not uniformly the case. When Professor Carney was a graduate student at UCLA, he wrote a very important paper, one of several important papers, that looked at the association between relationship satisfaction and whether that relationship ended in divorce. These were all marriages. And that correlation, as he points out in this chapter of the book, is not that high. That's not a perfect correspondence, right? We know that there are people who are unhappy or moderately happy or kind of happy, but not really ecstatic about their relationships, tend to stay in their relationships. And we know that there are people who are really happy in their relationship that get out of their relationship. Okay? Satisfaction and dissolution are different things. It stands to reason. It shouldn't come as a shock to you. But we do have to pull apart, we have to tease apart these two experiences that we have in a relationship, which is, how's it going for me right now? Do I feel satisfied? And is this an enterprise that I want to remain associated with? Right? And now we have to talk about another kind of comparison level. And this one is called the CL-alt, the comparison level of alternatives. And so now we're not just talking about your expectation levels, like what is it that you expect or desire or believe you deserve within a relationship, but now we're talking about what other actual relationships or situations or experiences might you have available to you, right? So now we're talking about intentions to stay or leave, the freedom that you feel in being able to leave your relationship or stick around. Okay? It's going to be related to outcomes, right? I said, all else being equal, you're going to stay in rewarding relationships and leave unrewarding ones, but it's not a perfect correspondence. And the factor that makes that an imperfect correspondence is the CL-alt, the comparison level of alternatives. What other relationships might you jump into, right? What other things might you do, right? So I could be, again, we take the hypothetical case of someone with a certain kind of reward-cost structure, that is to say, an outcome structure, and another person who is exactly the same, and the first person has very few options. Maybe they live in a very small town, maybe they are kind of shy, and that's just hard for them to do. The other person doesn't have those constraints on them. The first person is going to be more dependent on that relationship. Okay? So we have to understand satisfaction and what I like to think of as dissolution propensity, the likelihood that something will end. We need to think of them differently, but in each case we think about them in a compared to what kind of sense. And when we think about dependency, we're talking about compared to what other relationships you might have. Okay, you see that? It's, you know, one thing scientists have to do is try to be precise in their language. And so some of this seems obvious to you, and what we're trying to help you do with this chapter is map on some of the intuitions that you already likely have with the lingo that social exchange theorists already are using. So these are ideas that probably aren't foreign to you, but part of it is getting the ideas, your ideas linked up to these terms and then getting them in this sort of foreign equation format. Okay, so how does the theory guide research? Well, lots of different ways. First, we know that if there is this disparity, this disconnect between satisfaction and dissolution, that there are people who are happy who leave relationships or unhappy who stay in relationships. Well, we know when people file for divorce that some people change their minds. Once you get closer to the brink of either a divorce, I mean, it's not essential that it's divorce, it's more a committed partnership that you think about leaving, right? So as you move closer and closer to thinking about ending a relationship, and you get closer to that decision, lots of times we back off from that. People back off from that. And why might that be? Social exchange theory helps us to understand this by saying that people encounter barriers, and people then recognize the investments that they have, right? So as you get closer and closer to ending a relationship with somebody, you say, well, what are the costs associated with me doing that, right? What do I lose in doing that, and what do I gain by jumping into another relationship? So we have to think about the costs and the barriers associated with leaving, as well as the investments that you've made. And the number of alternatives that you have available to you, right? So people don't leave satisfied relationships, research shows, because they've invested a lot, they don't have many alternatives, and there's some significant barriers. Maybe you have a bank account with your partner. Maybe you only have one car, and if you were to end your relationship, you would be stuck taking the bus to school every day until you found either a car or a better partner, right? So there are costs and barriers that we start to really have to confront when we think about ending a relationship. Right? So when the relationship is going along well, we weigh these things, but they don't feel quite so consequential. But as we get to the brink of making the decision, we really have to confront the realities. And we have to say, okay, what do I really lose? What are the barriers? What's keeping me in? Would it be really hard to explain my divorce to my mother? Like, how hard would that be, right? Or I have children, And my parents, this is not true of me, my parents divorced. If that were the case, I would say, I don't want to inflict that on my own children. I know that what that pain was like for me, so I'm not going to do that. That becomes a barrier, right? That becomes a barrier. You stay, and there's sort of an invisible wall around your relationship. So theory guides research lots of different ways. These are two examples. The second example is dependent people, people who have a certain kind of reward structure and then a comparison level of alternatives that leads them to stay in the relationship, that is to say, a low comparison level of alternatives. People in that sort of circumstance, lots of times they derogate their alternatives. They say, you know, I can't imagine my relationship might not be so great, but the alternatives that are out there, they're not so good either, right? So we sort of use our current experience. One of the ways that we maintain our relationship, I should say, and stay within a relationship and stay, in a sense, not in a pathological sense, but in a social exchange theory sense, dependent on that relationship, is we say, you know, my comparison level for alternatives is really high. Like I would have to really have some great options to leave this relationship, and frankly, the options that I see just aren't that good. Right? We put down those alternatives. They just, psychologically in our head, we sort of play this cognitive game that just don't look as good as they otherwise might. So this research shows that this is the case. So what do we like and dislike about social exchange theory? Well, social exchange theory, as we've said, allows us to understand why some people in distressed relationships stay together. But it's not a perfect theory. It's, in fact, none of the models that we're talking about in last class and this class are perfect. And in this case, the perspective doesn't really tell us so much about how those rewards and costs change over time. As you read in the social exchange literature, there's not a lot of understanding about how characteristics of our relationship that often are highly rewarding early on become less rewarding with the passing of time. How does that happen? Or how do we take on more costs, and how do we integrate those within the outcome organization the decisions that we make in our head, right? So we don't know. It doesn't help us understand change. And if you remember from chapter 1, that's one of the big things that we're in the business of doing. We want to understand, in part, how it is that a relationship is better at one time than another time, right? So this model doesn't exactly get us to that point. Question?
Does this theory expect that people's comparison levels could also change, or does it assume that those will be stable?
I think the question is, do CL alts change? Does the alternative change? And I think the answer is yes. I think people
Alternatives or their expectations?
Any of the comparisons can change. You know, as people do more research, they become more and more aware. And this is where the design issues that you learned about in the last class get connected up with the theoretical issues. So as you think about relationships, not just as something that you could measure at one point in time, but as interesting dynamic processes that unfold over long spans of time, then you start to measure comparison levels and alternatives, and you actually demonstrate that they do change. So in that way, the empirical evidence starts to suggest new refinements of the theory. Question?
I know that some research by Daniel Gilbert of Harvard suggests that people are pretty bad at predicting what will make them happy, and also research in neuroeconomics shows that people don't always make rational decisions. How does this theory account for that?
Well, that work is, this model is from the 50s. So these are concepts that really emerge from fairly basic ways of thinking about economics and don't really incorporate these new ideas. But that would lead us to think that it would lead us to, I think, really draw an underline under this point that our rewards are going to change. What you see initially in a relationship may be quite different from, and what attracts you to a relationship may be quite different from what keeps you in a relationship. And if you go into a relationship with certain sorts of hopes and goals within that relationship, and then you are not really able, following Dan Gilbert's work, to project from them into how your partner is going to evolve or develop and how your relationship is going to change, then you have to engage in an adaptive process. You have to somehow make sense of this new information that's come into the system. That is largely outside this theoretical perspective. In fact, the next theoretical perspective that I want to talk about, social exchange theory, really gets after these interpersonal processes a bit more directly. Social exchange theory really takes us more, social learning theory takes us a little more deeply into the actual processes. So for me, one of the most interesting things, I study newlyweds, and so in my lab over in Friends Hall, I bring newlywed couples into my lab and I videotape them and I interview them and talk with them, and then over 5 or 10 years I follow them and I see which ones divorce and which ones end up miserable and which ones stay happy. And what you realize is that relationships do change. The level of positivity in relationships, on average, drops off over the first, it's evident over the first 2 years that there's drop-offs in the level of positivity. And then the question is, which most people wouldn't say what they'd expect. They'd say, wow, I love Betty. This is the greatest relationship. Betty's always going to be there for me. We're going to have sex this much every month for the rest of our lives. Wow, this is great. I can't wait. And then lo and behold, that doesn't happen, right? And I think that's one of the tricks that nature plays on us, is that nature wants us to be in relationships, right? We're in relationships, as you learned in chapter 1, in part to procreate, right? Nature has given us that capacity, and we sort of lose track of the idea that what has to happen is we have to sort of adjust to the realities that then come online, right? Relationships, good relationships are ones that you say, some couples, and I've had couples say this when I've done consulting work with them, say, it's just not the way it used to be. And I say, well, someone promised you that? Like, I don't remember, did someone guarantee that your relationship wasn't going to change? The question isn't, does it change or does it not change? The question is, how do you adapt to this new reality, right? What sort of characteristics can you create within your relationship? What is sort of the new interactional processes that you can put online to say, wow, we don't do this so much anymore, but this new part has opened up in our relationship. And that's the task in relationships, right? That's the adaptive challenge in our relationships. Social learning theory, which I want to talk about next, gets us a little closer to that. Social learning theory says that in the same way that social exchange theory talks about rewards and costs, but usually this is what are the two theories of learning? Anybody? Operant conditioning, did you say? Operant conditioning is one. And classical conditioning, right? We are now talking about operant conditioning, also known as Skinnerian conditioning, right? So now we're talking about not associationistic learning, which is the Pavlovian conditioning that you probably learned and forgot about. This is Skinnerian conditioning, where if you reward something, it happens more, and if you punish something, it happens less, right? So now we're talking about using that idea and building it into our relationships. And now we're saying, okay, I evaluate my relationship based on how good it feels. I base my relationship on the amount of rewards I've got coming my way, in fact, the way my partner treats me, and on the punishments that I'm receiving as well. Okay? So that's sort of, now we have to switch goggles, right? Now we're switching goggles. We're not the economist. We're not the rational economist that the social exchange theorists want us to be. Now we're looking through rewards and punishments specifically in our conversations. Okay? Social learning theory takes us inside the conversation. Social exchange theory is much more inside my head. Social learning theory inside our conversations. Okay, so now we're talking about transactional processes. It's not as though those weren't present in social exchange theory. They are. But a social exchange theorist says, wow, it's really interpretational. It's really all the inferences that I'm drawing to generate outcomes and think about my comparison levels and all that, right? Now, social learning theory started by a bunch of clinical psychologists. And they said, well, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm in the 60s, when the divorce rate was really, really high. you all know the divorce rate has been going down now since 1980. It was very high in the 1960s. And the stigma associated with seeking therapy had reduced. So people were more inclined to seek therapy. Couples were more inclined to seek therapy. And they went to some people like these people up on the board, Bob Weiss, Gayla Margolin, now at USC, also appears on the videotape, and the late Neil Jacobson from the University of Washington, went to people like this and they said, we need to understand these intense conversations that these unhappy people are having. We need to understand how it is that they're arguing with one another, right? So this view takes us right inside the conversations because that's what they saw. Right? I'm a practitioner. I see you guys pummeling each other psychologically. You're just saying mean things to each other, and you don't have much capacity for generating positive emotions within one another. You see how that's different from social exchange theory? Now we're right in the middle of the conversation, and my job as a social learning theorist is to improve your conversations, to make it more rewarding and less punishing. Okay, so they really focused first on unhappy, engaged, negative people, and they were trying to figure out ways to make those conversations less unpleasant and maybe even, if they were lucky, more pleasant. Okay, so these people are all clinical psychologists. And the idea is that our behavior is molded and shaped within relationships. You heard about that in attachment theory. Rewarding and punishing interactions affect how we behave with one another. So if I'm in a bad relationship and you say something nasty to me, well, I'm going to say something nasty back to you, right? That's sort of a basic characteristic of human behavior, especially in unhappy relationships. And as a result of these conversations that we're having, I'm going to make a judgment about whether or not this is a good relationship. Okay? So it's not totally distinct from social exchange theory. In fact, none of the 5 models are totally distinct from one another. But it's different. It's different, and its focus is really on the rewards and costs. The rewards and punishment is really the better way, the Skinnerian way of thinking about it, that really make us happy or unhappy in relation to one another. And it really focuses on communication. Really focuses on communication intently. Okay, so that's sort of the basic idea when you put on these goggles. And the idea is that behavior matters. Right? There's a reality to our relationships that is the starting point for the psychological judgments that we might make. But that behavior is sort of a core element in every relationship. The way that we talk to our partner, it's really, really hard to have a relationship with your partner if you don't have back and forth exchange. In fact, in Chapter 1, that was a defining criterion for relationships, that interdependence, the fact that when I behave, it affects you, and when you behave, it affects me. Right? There's that connection that we have with one another. So behavior is the final common pathway that gives us some insight into how a relationship is going to evolve and change. Appraisals of our interactions accumulate. So I can have a conversation, and let's say it's even a slightly heated conversation, and 2 people, in fact, I've seen this in my laboratory, 2 people get done with the conversation that we've asked them to talk about something and try to resolve the disagreement between them. We do this all the time in my lab. And one person said, wow, we sort of had to yell at each other a little bit, but we really cleared the air. You know, I feel a lot better because we cleared the air. The other person says, wow, that was really painful. We just yelled at each other. We didn't clear the air. Now I feel even worse than when we started. Right? The exact same conversation can lead different people to have what I call appraisals, judgments, conclusions that they make, not in general about their relationship, but about the conversation we just had. Right? So we call that an appraisal. I've just appraised the conversation. I've sort of thought about the negatives and the positives, and now I'm making a judgment about that. So we have these conversations. We make some appraisals. We make a judgment about those conversations. And sure enough, when I then start another conversation, I'm going to have that appraisal in my head as a way that I'm approaching the next conversation. And our relationships become biased in a good direction or biased in a bad direction, depending on the nature of those appraisals. Escape conditioning is an important and specific kind of interactional exchange between two partners in an intimate relationship whereby a negative thing happens. My partner nags me to do something. And she escalates in her nagging to get me to do something. And then finally, when she's gotten to the point where I really can't tolerate that anymore, I finally give in. I say, fine, I'll do the taxes. Fine, I'll take out the garbage. Fine, I'll wash the dog. Okay? So the negative has been met with a positive. Finally, you're contributing to the household. I have been rewarded for nagging you. Okay? So if that is the case, and if we believe what B.F. Skinner said, that positives reward, the offset of a negative is a positive, right? Minus a minus is a plus. We have just engaged in coercion or escape conditioning, right? So in the short term, that works really well. My wife got me to wash our dog. Good deal, right? But over time, the theory goes, there is an accumulation of these experiences so that she has been rewarded, and therefore the next time the dog is dirty, she will not go through the lower level nagging. She'll just walk in the room and say, why hasn't the dog been washed? My God! Because that's what she was rewarded to do, right? She was rewarded to just come in at the highest possible level. I didn't reward her at the lowest possible level, which was, honey, do you smell something funny? Like when the dog walks by, do you smell something funny? It smells kind of funny in here. That's sort of the hint that men don't get, right? Honey, I'm telling you to wash the dog. I'm giving you the option of saying, hey, the dog smells a little funny. I'll take her down to, the place I go is the Dogromat on Venice Boulevard. I'll take her to the Dogromat. Why don't I just do that, honey? You stay home, I'll take care of it, right? I didn't pick up at the clue at that level, right? I didn't pick up the clue until the highest level. So that's where interpersonal insensitivity leads the other person to keep trying and escalating to get the other person's attention, and eventually they do get their attention, they get their reward, and it has a short-term benefit, but it has a long-term cost. Okay? So you can see now we're in the heart of the conversation. We're in the reward, the punitive things that partners say to one another, and then sometimes the inadvertent rewards that we give for those negative behaviors. You see how that works? Now, there's a whole nother way of thinking about it, and that is that a lot of our positive behavior should be spontaneous, right? We shouldn't have to be constrained by, we can offer in an unsolicited way a lot of positive kinds of behaviors, and that's why most of us want to be in relationships. We come home and we say, our partner says, so how's your day? And we say, wow, it was okay. And your partner says, oh, just okay. Well, tell me about it. Well, that feels good, right? That feels good. So we are positioned not only to be prisoners of the behaviors that our partners show us, but we can also generate positive behaviors. And in fact, a lot of research, which you'll read about in the conflict chapter, shows that our ability to spontaneously generate positive emotion like humor, interest, and affection when our partner is talking to us are profoundly beneficial in our relationships, so much so that if you're not so good at communicating, but you're pretty good at generating positive emotion, that your relationship can stay pretty healthy. Now, as people got into this research, and this is early 1980s, people said, well, here's something funny. There are some relationships where people take things the wrong way. Like, you offer some feedback to your partner about the way they dress, and they take that as criticism, right? So, two people hearing the exact same thing can walk away, can hear that in different ways, right? You've probably all had this experience. You come home at the end of the day. You're home and your partner comes home at the end of the day and you hear the front door slam, right? The front door slams and you could say, why is that bastard slamming the door? That is just not right. I deserve to be treated better. Or you say, wow, it must be windy out there, right? The exact same thing in our relationships takes on all kinds of different meanings. Here's an example. I don't know if I have any time left at all, by the way. 3:47. I do have time. I was doing couples therapy. Back when I was doing couples therapy at the University of Illinois, that's where I got my degree. A young couple was, they'd been living together for quite a while, and they were wondering about whether they should get married. And so they came to me, a 26-year-old graduate student who knew nothing at all about this, but, you know, you pretend. When you're learning, you pretend. And eventually you kind of get good at it. And so they're talking, and the wife said, you know, honey, I'm not so sure about this relationship. And this was in the hot summer in central Illinois. Have any of you ever been to Champaign, Illinois? More power. Oh, you have? Why? What's that? Your boyfriend goes there. Wow. Champaign, Illinois is the flattest place in the world. Am I right about this? It's the flattest place in the world. When your dog runs away in Champaign, Illinois, you can see it for like 4 days. It's really true. It's very flat. Like you can see all the way to Chicago almost. So anyway, hot summer, central Illinois. And the woman says, honey, I'm not so sure about this relationship. Like the level of physical intimacy in our relationship has dropped off really quickly in the last, month or so. And the husband, I'll never forget his face, or the husband-to-be, I should say, the man, said, I thought we weren't having sex because the air conditioner was broken. The exact same event. And he's oblivious, like, oh, it'll cool off eventually. And she's going, our relationship is going down the pot, So eventually people then added, the original version of the model was really overt behavior. It was really the observable characteristics of behavior. Then as the model evolved, it took on more of this cognitive component. Not in the same way that social exchange theory had, but in an interpretational sense, in the sense that within a relationship, the exact same event can take on different meanings, okay? So that when you're in a relationship, you have to understand that the way you see things is different from the way your partner sees things, right? Or that two people in different relationships will see the exact same thing in different ways as well. Okay, so that's a little bit about social learning theory. What do we do with social learning theory? Well, we spend a lot of time looking at people talking to one another, and we've developed really good dictionaries for understanding communication when people engage in communication on either solving problems or talking to one another about daily events in their lives. Because most of this emerged from clinical psychology in the 70s and 80s, most of this has been conflict-oriented. The idea was that conflict and mismanagement of conflict was really the true cause of distress in couples' relationships. So people said, well, if I need to look at the rewards and punishments that people are delivering toward one another, I need to look at that. I need to see them talking to one another and look at that. And we've now developed really good technologies for, it's expensive and time-consuming, but we now have really good technologies for looking at couples' conversations and then quantifying communication. And so, as Ben has outlined here, there's a kind of study called the talk table study, which was one of the first studies that got people to start thinking about cognitive processes with a talk table. One individual in a relationship, it's sort of artificial. One individual is sitting down across from their partner, and they've got two buttons in front of them. And one button says intent, and one button says impact. The other person has the exact same setup, right? They're in a laboratory. And one person says, honey, I would like to spend time with my family over the holidays instead of your family over the holidays. And then this person is asked to say, well, what was the intent of what you just said? That was just a neutral statement of what I wanted. So that's neutral, right? My partner then says, hears this and says, well, that's pretty negative. I don't want to spend time with my family. That's a negative, right? And then partner then says, well, when are we going to spend time with my family? And she then says, here's my intent. That was a neutral statement. And the guy on the other side says, that wasn't neutral. That was critical. When are we going to spend time with my family? You're always whining. Why are you whining? That's a negative statement, right? So you can pull apart in a relationship the intent behind what you're trying to say, And I think we've all had this experience, right? We're trying to say something nice and your partner distorts it, right? Almost always in a negative direction. And we can look at the relationship between the intent and the impact, right? And happy and unhappy couples don't differ in their intent. Everybody tries to be nice, but the impact turns out to be negative, right? The impact in unhappy couples tends to be way more negative than the impact in happy couples. So you can pull apart the conversational sequence, and this is one way to disentangle some of those elements that social exchange theory tells us we should be doing. Observational coding, I've sort of already alluded to. We videotape people, we put them in a laboratory with their permission. We say we'd like you two to talk with one another and work toward a resolution of some problem. Go ahead and identify a problem. Then you leave the room and you'll let them talk for a while. And you see how well they handle that sort of task. Then you can create other kinds of tasks as well. And then trained coders look at those videotapes and quantify the rewards and the punishments, and especially the emotional quality of those behaviors. Negative reciprocity is another sort of interactional exchange. It's really something that we've learned about as a result of observational coding. And this is the idea that in unhappy couples have a lot of structure in their conversations. There's a high degree of predictability that if one person says something negative, the other person will say something negative as well. When you're in an unhappy relationship, if you've ever been in an unhappy relationship, you'll probably know this phenomenon. You feel like it's hard to extract yourself from arguments. Like you get stuck in a swamp, kind of. And you can't really see the bigger issue that your partner is raising, but you do see the negative emotion that they're delivering toward you. Happy couples are able to break that negative reciprocity. You know, they're able to say, Joe's a little bit unhappy now. It's not going to do me any good to start screaming back at him. I might even want to try to understand him. So instead of saying, oh yeah, I'll say, tell me more about it, right? Unhappy couples get locked into a high degree of structure, a high degree of predictability, and it's hard for them to extract themselves from that negative emotionality. And this is what we've learned from, one of the many things that we've learned from social learning theory, is that negative reciprocity is kind of a hallmark, kind of a signature of an unhappy couple. And their arguments they get more locked in, they get more entrenched, and there's more behaviors, there's more exchange behaviors in a disagreement sequence among unhappy couples than is the case with happy couples. Happy couples argue. It's not the case that they don't argue. Happy couples argue, but they're able to extricate themselves from the negativity much more quickly. Now, this idea that that our behaviors are in part a product of the rewards and punishments that we're delivering toward one another, and that there are interesting kinds of experiences like that coercion sequence that I mentioned to you a minute ago. This idea implies a very powerful idea of its own, and that is that if you only communicate better, you will have better relationships. In theory, we should all be trainable, we should all be educable in how to have a better relationship if we only deliver fewer punishments and more rewards, right? So this is a kind of a technologically simple idea that if you do this in your relationship, you should experience better appraisals after each conversation and then higher levels of satisfaction. And that's a complicated idea, it turns out. And you'll talk a lot about that in the intervention segment of the course. But it is an idea that has gotten a lot of play in the public policy circles. And right now, there is something called the Healthy Marriage Initiative that is funding a lot of projects to try to understand whether or not that's the case, whether that is the way to make relationships stronger. So this has all kinds of interesting implications, and probably best to wait so you hear the full story on those. You could imagine that if these clinical psychologists were in a room and they heard all of these exchanges of punishment and punishment and punishment and not much positivity, not much reward within these conversations, that they would develop interventions exactly around that idea. Like how can we break these cycles? And there were many, many studies to test that idea. And it turns out I'll just foreshadow where that later lecture is going to go. It turns out that here's what happened. People would end therapy successfully, and they would say, wow, we're really good at solving our problems. We don't punish each other when differences of opinion come up. On the other hand, I really don't like my partner, right? I don't like them. We communicate really well, right? But I just don't like them, right? So you can get really good at not being punitive and get good at solving your problems in a conflict-free way, but it doesn't mean your relationship is great. It doesn't mean it's the relationship you want to be in. So anyway, you'll hear tons more about that in the second to last chapter in the book. Okay, so what does social learning theory help us to explain? It helps us to explain how satisfied relationships change. Negativity accumulates. We get used to the positives in our relationship, and they take on less and less significance, but negativity can accumulate. And if you don't take care of that, it'll accumulate, and you'll pay a price for that. And if you take this coercion idea really seriously, it means that some of it might even happen outside your conscious awareness. Like you don't quite realize what's going on sometimes. And you don't realize that effective communication, especially if you've been in a relationship for a while, not like a year, but 5, 10 years, 20 years like me, you have to sort of put some effort into it. And if you don't really sort of take stock and think about what you're doing, you get stuck in a rut, and then you don't sort of leave yourself options for being rewarding in your exchanges. That's a really important element in social learning theory. What's it leave out? Why is it that some people are more negative than others in their communication? Where does that come from? Social learning theory does not care. We don't care. We just care that this is what you have to change. Right? If you want a better relationship, this is what you have to change. This would turn out to be a very significant flaw, and you'll see in the treatment lecture why that is. And can people who are distressed ever get happy on their own? Like, how is it that if you have a certain degree of skill, like if you have a certain capacity for being rewarding or punishing, and that over time accumulates to be detrimental to your relationship, how do you, if that's your skill set, how do you get out of that, right? If your relationship is gradually dwindling and the quality of that relationship is gradually dwindling, how do you, without therapy, without a therapist coming in and saying, you guys, you're really not being very rewarding toward one another. This is really a punitive kind of experience. You realize that you're not saying very nice, sweet, sensitive things to one another. In the absence of that sort of intervention, it's not really clear how a couple would sort of extricate themselves from their relationship difficulties, and yet we know that happens. Okay? So that's social learning theory. And now I'm going to turn to the third and final theoretical perspective that you will read about in Chapter 3 and that you'll hear about in this class. And these are social ecological models. Social ecological models are relatively, oddly enough, even though we're going to talk about them as having started back in the 40s, they have taken on a new significance. They've sort of been bubbling on a back pot for a while, and now, for interesting reasons, people are starting to integrate them with other perspectives. And by a social ecological model, social ecology refers to the context in which a relationship unfolds, right? And the idea is that if your relationship is, we don't usually realize it, but our relationship is connected up with lots of other factors that are going to impinge upon the relationship. So, for example, you could imagine two people who are in a typical, normal, healthy relationship, and if it so happens that one of them lost their job, but the other one didn't, just by chance, and the relationships are otherwise identical, that those relationships would unfold in different ways. Now that couple has a challenge. They have something that they need to deal with, right? Or now imagine, in fact, I just read a study like this. Now imagine that one of those couples has a very low birth weight child, right? Or have something horrendous happen to their child. Well, those two relationships now are different, right? In the interior, what's going on in the inside of those relationships Whether you think about that from social exchange theory or from social learning theory, those relationships are different now, right? So the social ecological model encourages us to realize that the stresses, supports, and constraints in the environment of a couple affect the way partners think, the way they feel, and act in their relationships. And when we think about social ecological models, we think about this man, Reuben Hill, a family sociologist, and Yuri Bronfenbrenner, a psychologist and a human developmentalist at Cornell University, who passed away 3 or 4 years ago. So that's the social ecological perspective. And there's some lingo here, just like there's got to be lingo with all of these theoretical perspectives. But if you look in the chapter, you'll see this series of concentric circles with the couple in the center of the model. And around them are increasingly distant sets of influences on the couple. So immediately around your relationship, you might think, well, there's the other people who you know. There's the roommates that you have. There's your parents' point of view on your relationship with another person. There's what your siblings think. There's what your friends think. There's an immediate social and even environmental context, so that if you have a relationship and you live in an expansive mansion, well, that's going to be really different than if you share the basement of your parents' home, right? Those are different relationships. Different circumstances are going to affect what your relationship is like. That's the microsystem. The mesosystem is one step removed from that, and now we're talking about things like cultural influences, things like the neighborhood that you live in, right? Things like attitudes toward your kind of relationship. So, for example, a gay couple who is in West Hollywood is pretty different from a gay couple that's in Wyoming, right? A gay couple that's in California and who's unable to get married, well, they know that their government and the majority of people, voting people in their state, view their relationship different than somebody who is in Iowa or Massachusetts or maybe Washington, D.C., right? So the relationships that we have are affected not only by our immediate friendship circles or the day-to-day stuff that you've got going on in your life, but one step removed from that, there's a mesosystem. Meso means middle. There's a middle set of influences which has to do with cultural influences and the role of religion in people's lives and things like that. Further from that, we have the macro system, the biggest possible influence, or the source of influence that affects many people simultaneously. So now we're talking, for example, about the global economy. Right? There are characteristics of the global economy. There are characteristics of people's religious beliefs that then might affect your mesosystem. Right? If you happen to be the person who was in New York City on 9/11, well, you might have been influenced by a macro system that had a certain view about an American worldview, right? Or a way that our economy was working that rubbed other people the wrong way, okay? And that can come home to roost directly in your relationship, okay? So there are issues of jet travel. Like we could all get on a plane and be in New Zealand in 15 hours, right? 100 years ago, that wasn't possible. We can now get on the phone right now and call somebody in New Zealand and find them in their office, right? I mean, that's amazing. The world has changed. And if that's your partner, now you can keep in touch. Now you can keep in touch really regularly, even though they're almost anywhere on the globe. Okay, so those are big macro level influences. They might not influence each and every interaction that you have with your partner, but they influence many different people in small ways. So that's especially what is called a Bronfenbrennerian perspective. That's Yuri Bronfenbrenner's model of relationships. He didn't mean for that to involve couples so much. He was thinking more about children, but it's been adopted by people like me in the relationships field because it really helps to contextualize people's relationships. And we know, for example, that people who live in rougher neighborhoods engage in marital interactions that have more conflict and more tension and less warmth in them. The actual communication between partners in a relationship is indeed affected by the context in which they find themselves. There's the ABCX model, which Hill proposed back in 1949. And here the idea is that when you're trying to understand adaptation to some sort of event that disrupts your equilibrium, like the loss of a job or a sick child or whatever that might be, that we have to understand that in relation to three things. The nature of the stressor itself. There's great variability in stressors. The resources that an individual or a couple has to deal with that stress, and then the interpretation that they make of it, right? And then the double ABCX model is basically the same thing. Ben outlines this Dr. Carney outlines this quite well in his chapter. But the double ABCX version now says we have to add a temporal dimension to that. That's a fairly static point of view, as though things don't change much. But we know stress accumulates, and we know it's harder to deal with stress when you've got a lot of stress as opposed to just one acute thing that you're dealing with. Resources fluctuate. Sometimes people help you. Sometimes you have more money than at other times. Sometimes you can turn to other people for help. And interpretations change as well, right? So what seemed like a chronic stress, what seemed at first like an acute stress that you're going to be able to deal with, well, now it feels like a chronic stress. We just can't shake it. You know, we thought it was just going to be a temporary thing when Joe lost his job, but wow, now it's a chronic stress, and we have to adjust to that. Let me just finish up here. Measuring reactions to stress. So the key idea of the social ecological perspective is that we cannot understand relationships without understanding all of the other things that happen. If you pick up virtually any self-help book on the shelf, it's always going to tell you about communicating better. The way to have a better relationship is to communicate better. But a big part of what we do in our daily lives in established relationships is manage stress. Right? And couples who can manage stress actually position themselves to strengthen their relationship. And couples who fall apart in the face of stress really will struggle in their relationship. So stress can be, the social ecological perspective is really key for drawing attention to this very basic and central element. And in fact, 2 days ago, the New York Times had a special little section about the role of stress on couples' relationships and whether this was seen as something that couples in general would be able to ride through, or whether this really foreshadowed some very difficult times ahead for couples and families. So you might want to take a look at that. It's quite interesting. Military families, you'll read about this in the chapter. The effects of war, for example, on couples' relationships. We know a lot about this now. Transition to parenthood is usually a normative stressor that couples have to deal with. Usually kind of throws people for a little bit of a loop when they have their first child. Relationship satisfaction typically goes down after the arrival of the first child. There's an air traffic controller study done by Rena Rapetti here at UCLA showing that if you do a diary study, which I think you've already learned about, if you do a diary study with air traffic controllers, you can see fluctuations in the quality of the weather and the number of planes that an air traffic controller has to land in any given point in time, and the quality of their marital interaction at home at the end of the day. So you see most of them were male, these air traffic controllers disengaging from their family on the high stress days relative to the low stress days. And then the adaptive response on the part of their partners was not to say, hey, you got to get involved in the family. You know, you got to pull your own weight in this family. We've got kids, we've got homework need to get done. The adaptive response is to recognize that this might be going on with your partner, a cognitive kind of process, obviously, and then support them rather than criticize them. So we can see fluctuations in environment, circumstances, weather, and the number of planes that someone's trying to land, and the quality of the interactions within their relationship. That's the power of the social ecological model. And so this perspective really forces us to take culture and SES seriously, because we do know, for example, I was just reading a paper this week that that European American and Asian American people seek social support in different ways, for example, that it can be easier for European Americans to seek help for a problem whereas at least within the research that Shelley Taylor and her colleagues have published, suggests that individuals with who are Asian American don't want to burden another person, so they're much less likely to sort of ventilate their feelings. So we know culture is yet another one of these factors in the set of concentric circles that impinge on people's relationships. So crisis theory, social ecological models, very good at telling us about why vulnerable relationships are going to break up. Vulnerable relationships are going to break up not when things are going well, right? Not when things are going well, but when stress really hits, right? And one of my colleagues, Phil Cowan, formerly at UC Berkeley, he says, you know, if everybody's riding on a bike and everybody's sort of on a flat terrain, well, you can't really tell who the good bike riders are and who the bad bike riders are. But if you send them up a hill, now you figure it out. Now you find out who can really adapt to the new stresses and strains. And stress is like that in couples relationships. Stress is like now you're going to go uphill. And some people are going to just keep on the same path and they're just going to keep cranking away because they know how to do that and they're unfazed by it. Other people are really going to struggle and they're going to fall back and they're going to be way back in the pack. So that's what crisis theory helps us understand, is that vulnerable relationships are going to break up when they start going up the hill. When that first child arrives, or when that child arrives and they're sick, or when Joe loses his job, or something catastrophic happens. What does it leave out? We don't know a lot from this perspective about where resources come from. Why is it that they sort of just are posited as an entity that exists, and we need to learn more about where those resources come from and how people generate those resources, right? And people in good relationships invest a lot in their resources knowing that they may not need them for a while. So, you know, you help other family members with struggles and strains that come up so that you know when you're in that position that you've sort of nurtured the social network around your relationship. And if you've been loaning somebody money because they needed it when they were in a tough period, well, now chances are good that you can call back that debt. And when you get into a rough place, you'll be able to get the support that you need. So social ecology theory is still coming to figure that out. Three last points. We need to knit these things together. We need to pull these theoretical perspectives together. And you're going to see tastes of them. You're going to see little hints of these models as we go through. Like when we talk about physical aggression, we're going to talk about attachment. We're going to talk about social exchange theory. You're going to talk about social learning theory. So you have to, you'll hear different hints of these different models, but they are not yet in a comprehensive version. We have a lot of different tools that allow us to learn new things about relationships, and that's going to force us to develop better theoretical perspectives. But right now, what you've heard about are some of the big picture ways of thinking about relationships, and you'll hear a lot about them, and we'll develop them in lots of interesting different ways. We'll learn about specific models of social support, specific models of disclosure, for example, specific models about how gender works in relationships. And in fact, that's what I'll talk about on Wednesday. We'll talk about sexuality, sexual orientation, and gender. Thanks for your attention. I will see you Wednesday.